Hi, I'm Danny Gregory, and this is a podcast that is still under development. We're still trying to figure it out. I am an artist, and see, I just tripped over that. I'm an author and artist, and a founder of Sketchbook Skool. And I'm joined here by my friend John Muir Laws.
Hi there, and I'm John Muir Laws, and I'm Danny's friend. I am an artist, scientist, curious explorer, and an avid journaler, and happy to be here exploring ideas in conversation with Danny Gregory.
In the Curious Sketchbook, a scintillating, long-winded podcast that will be coming to you every week until we get sick of doing it. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for being here, everybody.
Good day.
Good day to you, sir. How are you doing?
I'm great. I'm good. I had a fun weekend. My son was visiting from Los Angeles with his girlfriend, and we did a lot of stuff, and it was a fun weekend.
That's fantastic.
So, yeah.
What was the highlight?
We went to the Desert Botanical Gardens in the evening, where they have a Dale Chihuly show. So they have all these.
Oh,
yeah. So
fun.
they have all these. So there's all this beautiful desert landscape, and then in the middle of it are these incredible pieces. I mean, we've probably been to half a dozen of those kinds of shows now of Chihuly, but it's always inspiring and it's just beautiful. So, yeah, very nice.
That's great.
So we are going to create a podcast, or we're going to
think
try to
that's
figure
the
it out.
plan. That's right.
I'm rolling already because I thought, you know what, let's just talk about the idea of what we even think this is, and maybe that's going to be part of the first episode. So
I like it.
what do you think it is? What is this?
For me, it's an excuse to have interesting conversations. It seems to me that you're somebody that thinks about interesting things in ways that are interesting, and that interests me. So,
What an interesting thing to say.
Interesting, and I want to be I want to engage with ideas that are different than mine and the way that I usually think about things. And I like to I like the challenge of thinking along different lines. If I can get myself to do that on a regular basis, my brain is going to kind of keep growing in all sorts of interesting ways. And so it seems, but there's so little conversation these days. I don't sit down with human beings anymore because of COVID. And so the opportunity to kind of get to hang out on a regular basis and to talk and to play with ideas, I'm in.
I agree. I think that is, I find when I do talk to people, a lot of times it has some purpose, but it's rarely
Mm-hmm.
just conversation. It's usually a transaction, even with family and things like that. How are you doing? What's going on? What's new? Okay, good. Okay. So, yeah. Are you all right? Fine. Okay. So this will be an opportunity to have no particular agenda. And who knows, you and I may be the only audience for this, but that's fine too.
Yeah. So let's make it worthwhile for ourselves by engaging with ideas that excite us, challenge each other, and yeah, if nobody else listens to it, that's fine. We will then have gotten something out of it.
I agree. I was thinking about names for it, just because maybe there's some focus, so there's somebody's coming to it, they have some idea what it was. And the name I was kicking around that I liked the best was the Curious Sketchbook, just because it was about sketchbooks and it was about curiosity, but it felt kind of open, but I'm open to anything. That's just a first drop of sand in the oyster.
I like that. I like the idea of curiosity, of actively questioning things is something that I really try to strive to do, to try to make myself intentionally curious. And so part of that is sort of admitting that I don't know tons of stuff.
I think that's what makes life interesting, right?
Yeah.
And I think it's what I mean, because you kind of exist at the intersection of art and science, and those curiosity seems to be an important quality to have in both of those disciplines.
Yes. Yeah. So I think of it as critical, that, and it's also I think of it as a skill, curiosity as a skill that you can cultivate, and it gets better with practice.
It's an effort too, though, which is maybe why sometimes we don't want to engage in it.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, our brains, our brains are the most calorically demanding part of our body. So it's 2% of your body weight, and it uses, when you're actively thinking, it uses 20% of your energy,
Interesting. So,
and it's just so disproportionate. And so if we the easy thing to do is to, if so your brain doesn't have to work hard, is, not to be curious, to be just sort of accept things. And that, I think that there's a certain kind of satisfaction that comes from that, sort of thinking that you're right about stuff. But the more that you can push yourself to accept how much you don't know, I think then really interesting things will come from that.
maybe we should write the thinking man's diet book. Things to think about that will
Oh,
burn calories. So you could just sit in an armchair, like reading Wittgenstein or doing, some kind of figuring out various mathematical formulas and shedding pounds.
yeah. I at some point I remember hearing about the amount of calories expended by a chess master in a tournament. I don't remember the numbers, but yeah, if you can, yeah, think hard to get fit. There you go.
Hard to get fit. I like it. Okay, that could be the name of this podcast. Think hard to get fit. Think hard to
But
get
also
fit.
then tying in the sketchbook with that. Sometimes people think of a sketchbook as just drawing pictures, so maybe a journal. It's this extension of your brain,
Right.
and that when you get curious, and then you get curious on the pages of your journal, you can do so much more on a piece of paper than you can do just kind of sloshing around in your electric meat. That I find that, like, if you work it out on paper, your ideas will be better, and you'll have a better understanding of what your ideas are. You can also hold so much more on paper than you can just between your ears.
Because you're externalizing them. You're taking it out of your head and putting it, making it other, which allows you to kind of look at it differently and see it
Yes,
differently.
yeah. And people talk about the idea of metacognition, of how you are, metacognition being thinking about what you're thinking about. But the minute you start thinking about what you're thinking about, you're now no longer thinking about what you were thinking about. You are thinking about that same thing. So you can't watch yourself think about whatever topic it is.
Wait, let me
But
think
if
about
you
that. Yeah.
yeah, but then if you get it down on paper, you can then look at the notes that you have on paper, and you can see the way that you're thinking.
I mean, I find I don't know if you're like this, but I find a lot of times I'm sitting there thinking about something. I think in bed a lot, so I wake up in the middle of the night, as you know, because I just sent you that huge list of things we can write about because
Which
they
was
came to me in the
impressive.
middle of
It was
it was
impressive.
it was offensive. I told my wife about it and she said, "What are you doing?" Just for the casual listener, just so you know, I woke up at 4 o'clock in the morning and I started thinking, getting so excited about these conversations I was going to have with Jack that I started spewing out a huge list of things that I don't know, like hundreds of things. And then I sent them to him and she said, never send anyone an email before dawn. It's really offensive.
But it did show me that you're all in on this idea. So
Yeah, why not? I was at 4 in the morning. I still
that's
am.
right.
I still am in the daylight hours too. But yeah, so but what I was going to say is that I find that if I'm kicking ideas around in my head, I really need to have something to write down on. Something to not necessarily to write the ideas down, but just to have a piece of paper and have a pen in my hand. And a lot of times I'll just like write a word and then I'll sort of draw a line connected to another word. And that sort of mind mapping thing is part of what I do. But I definitely
Hmm.
feel like I need to go through that process. And it's not necessarily even like building an outline. I'm not, I'd like to be one of those writers who sits down, cranks out an outline, and then just easily turns that outline into an essay. But I do feel the need to still sort of like have it on paper, see all the bits, and then that somehow rearranges what's in my head, and then I can write from there.
Well, and what's kind of critical about that, if those sort of random things on paper, is that unlike an outline, it's nonlinear. You can sort of start with whatever it is, and then you're looking for relationships, and those are those lines that you start to draw between things. You're making connections. But if you were to sit down and just kind of put it into outline form, I don't think that there's as much room there for you to think laterally. I think the outline is useful once you have all your ideas in place and you want to figure out the document. You want to sort of write the book, but for but that's not. I think that's more of a structuring process rather than a generative process. So those.
Right. Because that's a different stage in ideation. The first stage is just dumping stuff out of your brain. And then the second stage is sort of starting to organize it. And then the third stage is culling it and kind of getting rid of the excess bits that don't fit into the flow. But that's all much further down the line. And you don't want to think about structure too early because if you do, it definitely gets in the way of your just flowing ideas, right?
Mhm. So, do you currently have, as you're sitting there, do you have a pad of paper in front of you with some words, notes, and doodles on it so far?
For this
Yeah.
particular discussion, I don't. I have several things in front of me that have stuff written on them, but they have nothing to do with this conversation. I do also have on my phone that giant 4 a.m. list that I sent to you, but I haven't honestly looked at it since we talked. I feel like it's there as a crutch, honestly. I think
Hmm.
it's a
Hmm.
crutch. It's sort of like, you know what? I know that if I get nervous about, well, will we have anything to talk about? I can just glance at that list. I'm not necessarily even going to pull things out of that list. Like I find what like I write these essays every week, and I have hundreds and hundreds of little snippets of ideas that came to me while I was listening to a podcast or came to me in the middle of the night or came to me while I was reading something, and I put them down there, but I find that they're a crutch because every so often I'll say, okay, I should go and look at those snippets. I'll go and look at those ideas and then I might have an idea. So the snippet itself isn't actually the idea. It's just simply the reassurance that I'm capable of thinking of ideas. And
Hmm.
then I can actually go off and think of one. It's I don't know if that's a normal thing, but that's kind of the way it works for me.
Yeah. Yeah. Just sort of knowing that the well is not dry
Right.
is that's a good place to start. But I find it's really, if I don't write stuff down, there are these kind of beautiful threads that I lose. So for me, I kind of keep little notebooks that are just when I'm in conversation with with one person, I'll sort of just start a page from that, and there's and then I may not need to come back to that later on, but just because I had that page going while I was talking to that person, I think that my thinking is a little bit better. So it's if I lose these notes, that's going to be okay. But if, well, actually, no, I do find myself kind of coming back and regularly kind of digging. I know I've got that idea in there. I'll look through it and like, yes, there is that kind of key idea. So what I will also do is sometimes put little stars or a big arrow or googly eyes next to the best ideas that sort of pop out in things. And that helps me then find it later on as I'm kind of scanning through those notebooks.
Yeah, I understand that process too, and I feel like I go back to it and I look at it, and sometimes it is helpful to me when I sit down to write something. But I've been not struggling, but exploring new ways of writing over the last few months and new tools to use. There's a lot of discussion right now about this thing called the second brain, which I'm sure you know about too, which is basically if we spend a lot of time reading things and absorbing information. Well, absorbing is perhaps the right word, but encountering information, and maybe you highlight things. Maybe you take notes, and then maybe you have a repository of all those notes, and so you have, like, maybe it's computer files or notebooks full of stuff, but it's inert until you start to make connections between those different things. And when you do, those things
Mm.
can generate new ideas, right? So the idea of the second brain, and it's not an incredibly sophisticated technology, but it's definitely a technology that is sort of coming into its own now, which is that you can take all of these notes that you have and put them into a computer repository, and then you can create links between them. And
Mm.
so then the individual notes and pages are all in this giant network of linked connections. And that those linked connections, which may not have occurred to you when you read one thing 3 months ago and another thing yesterday, start to become clearer because of this second brain idea. And it's also called the second brain because the idea is you can't possibly hold all that stuff in your head.
Yeah.
So you need another place to put it, and a computer is a perfect place to put it, but only if you can access it in a useful way. And so much note taking and note gathering software is hierarchical, and that's not necessarily that useful for this. So in other words, you put it in folders and folders and folders and notebooks and so forth. But ideally, it should all float free so that it can make new connections.
So
And
you're saying
so
that
it
this
is
is more kind of relational.
relational, yeah. So it's tied not to where it resides, but it's tied to what its content is. So therefore, you can have an idea that might be connected to a completely different idea somewhere else. And for instance, say you're reading a book and there's one sentence that really stands out to you, and it may not have anything to do with the sentences before and after it, but it may connect really beautifully to something completely different in some other place. But if it's too tied down to its location, it can't make that connection. So I don't know. It's very complicated, and I've been trying to play with it, and I'm finding that I think my brain is probably going to do a good enough job on its own without this. But it's interesting to me. So going back to the idea of curiosity, I've spent a lot of time just researching this and looking at these tools and reading articles by people and basically doing research into research rather than actually doing the thing.
Hmm. Well, in my practice, I have these sort of three kind of core ideas of observation, curiosity, and creativity. And the way that I kind of frame those is I notice, I wonder, and it reminds me of. So my working definition for creativity ties into what you're talking about here with these connections and networks. My working definition for creativity is your brain's ability to make useful connections between seemingly unrelated things. That seems to be a lot of what you're talking about here with these systems. Is first not losing these little pieces, and then kind of uh, giving them little hooks that can tie into other ideas.
Right.
Um,
So it could be the equivalent of like tags or keywords or things like that that
Hmm.
you use in
Hmm.
in computer databases. But it's still the problem with that is still it's still problematic because you have to know what that hook is going to be, and it may actually be a hook that doesn't reveal itself until it comes into contact with some other thing, right? Like it might change its meaning. But anyway, yes,
Well,
go on with what you were saying. I notice, I wonder, it reminds me of. I like that.
I notice. I wonder what it reminds me of. So that's my kind of my naturalist mantra, and the part that I'm really kind of focusing on here, or kind of tying in, is this the idea of it reminds me of, which is deliberately trying to tie into looking for connections between ideas. And so you're observing some sort of phenomenon, say just the way that drying mud is cracking on the playa, and you deliberately say to yourself, what does this remind me of? And you try to kind of go into your banks of your brain system to see what can you dredge up that in one way or another relates to this. Sometimes those kind of connections, they just pop into your head, but if they're not popping into your head, you can often kind of go and root them out a little bit by just deliberately saying, like, what does this remind me of? And then noting those things. And these can be stuff that you've read. These can be sort of scientific things. These can be things from the arts. These can be things that are playful. They can be goofy things that your daughter did that morning. But this kind of intentionally trying to look for and build relationships, looking for patterns, I find a really interesting and rich process. So that's why I like your idea there of this second brain. It's not just a a a, a system of file folders for ideas, but you want to be kind of teasing out what are the relationships between ideas and how does this connect to stuff that's already kind of dancing in your gray matter.
And the result of that is that it makes something new, right? So you form this connection and you say, okay, these cracks in the mud remind me of, I don't know, Jackson Pollock. And then you say, okay, so what else could that mean? Do I start making paintings by throwing mud around, or do I, look at, I don't know, there could be things that it spurs, right?
Mm-hmm.
You're taking these two things, A and B, and you're trying to create something brand new out of it, they're sparking each other. Yeah.
That's right. So you can look at that thing. If this does connect with something, then you can say, why is that? In what ways is it really like that? In what ways is it different than that? In what ways is this sort of is this sort of a metaphor for that? And in what ways is this a real direct connection? And sort of the biologist in me then starts that there's sort of a parallel in that of what the biologists talk about, adaptations that are analogies and homologies. And so when they're talking about this, what they mean is that you see some structure on these two critters, right? And let's say they both have spines. Do these both have spines because of a shared common ancestor, that somebody that they're related to had spines, and so both of these organisms have spines? Or is this a feature that, and that if there's an ancestor, then that's referred to as those are homologies. But if there's no relationship between the critters and they both have independently developed spines, then this is what's it's called these adaptations are then an analogy. And so you can also do that with, how is this like that other thing? What's going on with that relationship, or this sort of you've got analogies and homologies in there. You have, and do these cracks serve the same function, or the result of the same process that you are seeing in this other sort of thing, or is this an independent connection with this same pattern?
Right. So if you look at like a marsupial in Australia, right,
Mm-hmm.
it might have certain features that came about for completely different reasons than a mammal in Europe did, right?
Right. Exactly. Exactly.
So yeah, or even like something like a duckbill. A duckbill and a platypus might have arisen because of completely different reasons. So it's not an analogy. Is that
Yeah. So
making
then
that one?
it would
Yeah,
be an analogy. Yeah.
that's an
So
analogy.
that just these things look similar, but there's no kind of common ancestor. That if you go back in their lineages, they're related to critters that didn't have those. And this is it's a feature that has appeared two places because of the connection of form and function.
Right.
So
So how does that relate back to ideas then?
so when you get an "it reminds me of," you can say to yourself, like, why does this remind me of that? And again, in what way is it similar? In what way is it different? There's a relationship here. What is the strength of the relationship? What are the kind of what's the functionality perhaps behind this structure that I'm looking at? What is the origin of this structure or this feature that I'm looking at? And that, I think, helps you when you're saying kind of you have an idea or you make a connection and you can turn that into something new. I think that those sorts of insights help you with that last step there of taking this idea and then helping it morph into something that you can reapply in a new way.
Yeah, I mean, completely unrelated. I was thinking about, this new series that's been on Apple Plus, which is about the Beatles. And I don't know if you know anything about it, but so they have these. Peter Jackson edited together some 50 hours or more of footage that they had of the Beatles kind of in the year or so before they broke up and doing these recording sessions. And sort of interesting to see. I mean, I'm personally, not only am I not a Beatles fan, but I'm actually the opposite, where I actively am disturbed and troubled by the Beatles for psychological reasons I can go into some other time. But anyway, so I've been
That'll be
watching
an
it.
interesting conversation.
I've been watching it for other reasons, which is I'm always interested in the creative process and how people come up with ideas, and picking music, which is really mysterious to me, but music just kind of seems to sometimes flow out of people. And there's a scene that's the scene that probably people talk about the most from this series of documentaries, which is when Paul just starts playing a song that turns into a really recognizable song. So he's like playing a song, and it sort of vaguely seems familiar, and then it becomes increasingly familiar, and you realize like this melody is coming into focus, but it's sort of
Mm.
flowed into him, and then he sort of grabs it and shapes it, and it becomes, I forget what the song is actually, but it becomes that. And so it's really interesting to see that, it's sort of like he's kind of like tuning a radio almost and sharpening it. And suddenly you go, oh, that's a melody we all know. And, but what it made me think of, as speaking of this reminds me of, is it reminded me of this thing called another documentary called Some Kind of Monster, which is about Metallica. It's another band I'm not particularly fond of, but I watched it because it's about the making of this record that they did, and they brought in this documentary film crew that was going to film them working together on this record, and they were supposed to be in the studio for a month. It ended up being something like 530 days of filming it took to actually finish this record, because they were also going through all this trauma and breaking up, and one of their key original band members had left, and so they were trying to kind of reorganize the relationships between them. and creating and sort of figuring out whether they should stay a band. But they had a psychiatrist who was like the band shrink, who's with them through this whole thing. And he is sort of helping to bring them together and helping them to get over these, like, I mean, and they're much more aggressive than the Beatles were in terms of their the British. Beatles are very British about it, a lot of it, but this Metallica, which is obviously this heavy metal band, the biggest band in the world at the time, like the Beatles, but they go through this whole process, and he's focusing them and shaping them. And I kept thinking as I was watching the Beatles thing, if only they had a shrink, like they might have stayed together, you know. But also you see, like, what is it that happens when a creative collaboration doesn't work and when it does, you know, and what are the things that go wrong? A lot of it is power struggles, and it's also authenticity. Like, are you being real, or is somebody being motivated by ego, or are they being motivated by, you know, the need to make money, or what they think will be commercial, and somebody else wants to be authentic, and just, you know, just losing the original connection that brought them together. So interesting to me to watch both of those and thinking about just creative collaborations. So maybe we should start by getting a shrink, you and I. So we'll have
That's, I think we all could
we don't need
could
one.
use that. You know, anything that gives you people who are somebody who's there to help call you on your stuff and not just tell you that you're great is really helpful for everybody, because I think the our kind of default modes of thinking about things, we have the illusion that we're really pretty sophisticated, but I know I'm not. Yeah, so
I'm very sophisticated. You may be a yokel from California, but I'm a world traveler.
oh, good. That will help. That will help. That will help our insight.
Yes. Anyway, I jest.
But I wanted to just to when you're talking about Metallica, tell me a little bit more about you're saying that about the authenticity of what the band is doing, and it made me kind of wonder about and you're saying that, you know, for instance, when somebody is maybe more motivated by something that is commercial, I am wondering how that is, that if that is something that is authentically what is motivating and moving somebody, isn't that equally authentic?
Well, I think the question is, did they become successful because of their authenticity? So you have a band who begins together, right? They begin together and they make music that speaks to people, right? And it comes perhaps from their experience in some ways. It's funneled. Their experience is funneled through who they are and who they are as a group, and then it becomes something, and then people listen to it and they relate to it, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you have the
Okay.
Beatles. The Beatles, same kind of thing, right? Which is their have their life experience and their understanding of all the other music that's going on around them, and all those things make for music that becomes really successful at the beginning because people respond to it. And then over time, they start to live this really weird life, right? Imagine being like in the biggest band in the world, whether it's the Beatles or Metallica, you know, and like there's a whole big scene in Some Kind of Monster where one of the musicians is selling his art collection. And it's like he has multiple paintings that are each 7 and 8 figure value, and he's selling them through Sotheby's, you know, and you think like so far removed from what you think of as as like a rock band, right? These guys with like multi millionaires, you know, some of them with like
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
multiple wives, and one of them has a really bad substance abuse problem in the middle of it too. So it's like increasingly you kind of can't relate to where they're coming from, and the music that they're making is really more plugged into the music they used to make than it is plugged into their lives as they now lead them. you know,
Okay.
right? So similarly with the Beatles, there's a scene where they're kind of trying to write new songs, and then they end up pulling out all these songs that they made when they were 15. And they're like, remember this? And they start playing all these songs that I guess they hadn't recorded before, but there are these songs that they wrote when they were teenagers. And they're now like almost 30 and they've been a band together for like 10 years. And that's what they're going back to. And I think that happens with really successful creative people a lot. And they call there's the sophomore slump, right? You bring out an album or you make a movie or you write a novel and it's a huge success. And then it's like, great, now what are you going to do? And it's like, well, it took me 10 years to write that thing, right? Like if you're a band, you've been writing songs together, you've been making music together, and finally you get a record contract. Well, you take your best songs and you put them all into that thing. And then now it's like, okay, 9 months later, can
Now
we
do it
bring out
again.
another album? Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. And do it again and again and again. So now all the pressures that are on you have nothing to do with what those original pressures were, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because those pressures that you did originally might have been much more like, how do we find a voice? How do we express our experiences? And now suddenly it's like, well, how do we respond to the record company, to our
Yep.
audience, to the
Yep.
press, and so forth? And that just makes for it's not. And I think if you did that authentically, and there have been musicians and other artists who have made art about this situation that they find themselves in, but it's not that interesting. It's like I don't really relate to like, oh, my Lamborghini's in the shop and I don't know where to put my Oscar and I'm having problems with my money manager. It's like whatever. It's not I just can't relate to that quite the same way. So that is a problem for people. So that's I think part of the authenticity question.
I, that clarifies it. That makes a lot of sense to me.
Yeah. But let's go back to talking about sketchbooks because that's where we started. We talked about sketchbook as an idea, a playground for ideas, I guess. I don't think most people wouldn't think of sketchbooks unless it was like visual ideas. Like you wouldn't think of doing mind mapping and things like that in your sketchbook. But I think both of us have a point of view towards a sketchbook that it is a companion, right? It's a companion. It's something that's with us that we might use for drawing and painting in, but we also use it to kind of live our life in, right? That it's something that we'll work out ideas in and we will express maybe things about our life or capture things about our life in it as well. I think that, I mean, is that how you see it?
Yes, it is for for me the I guess I refer to it as my journal.
Right.
The journal a it is both a reflection of your experience and it is an amplifier and intensifier of your experience while you're having it. If I go to a place and explore, I very quickly will the details, the nuances, the lessons of whatever experience it is will begin to fade. If I listen to a lecture, I can be like, wow, that was amazing. That was riveting. And then somebody says like, well, what did the person talk about? And I'm like, now I don't remember. But it was really good. And that if I'm there with my journal and I am the it's in my hands and as we're exploring along, I am taking some notes of kind of highlighting the things that really stand out for me. It's going to help me work that into my life, into my thinking in a much more deliberate and direct way. So for me, it's an essential tool of engaging with the world, and that's why I'm very interested in just to I'll kind of give a little bit about my background. I'm a wildlife biologist. If people haven't met me before, I'm really interested in nature, and so if you look through my journals, it's nature, 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 nature. Here's the bird I saw. Here's the squirrel I saw. This is what the clouds were doing. And because that was what I was putting down in my journals. Those things, they became more vivid, more real for me. But the things that I wasn't putting in my journal, my brain isn't paying as much attention to those, and I was missing. I was missing all sorts of things. So I look through, say, you look at urban sketchers and the sorts of things that they're doing. There are these beautiful insights into place and community and the day by day experience that you're having that I wasn't getting. I can be, and so just recently I've started to try to. I actually made a cityscape in my nature journal. I'm being more deliberate now about including the shenanigans that my kids do in my journal. And
So it's expanding from being just a sort of a scientific tool to being more of a window to the world that you live.
yes,
Experience,
it's a lens for kind of experiencing my life through.
right.
And I do find when I use it, my experience is so much richer. And when I don't, I think I'm missing out. Now that
Yeah. I mean, I've talked about this before, but I feel like the process of drawing in my sketchbook and writing in my sketchbook are also a way of increasing the resolution of the memories that I'm making.
hmm
Sense that I can go back and look at a sketchbook from a really long time ago and remember exactly what that experience was like that day. You know, how I felt, what the temperature was like, what I ate for lunch, what else was going on around me. All those things are really heightened because it was like my brain is like super energized or super open during that experience. And the drawing is like a hyperlink back to that experience almost like by looking at the drawing,
yes.
I connect back to that day and those high resolution memories that are buried in my brain somewhere like they get activated like that drawing is the bookmark to those things. I keep using
Oh,
computer
I like
analogies, but
that.
yeah. so
Um,
I feel like the experiences that are being recorded aren't just visual. It's not only did I, do I remember the details of of that building and what the light was like on it and so forth,
mhm.
but as I said, I can also have memories of like I have a drawing I did of Washington Square Arch, and I was sitting there and I can remember this morning. It was Sunday morning. It was pretty early on a Sunday morning, like 7:30 or 8 o'clock. Streets were pretty empty. And I'm sitting there with my back against the arch and I'm drawing the view up Fifth Avenue, which is pretty empty, but I'm drawing the buildings and there's a couple trees and I can see the cabs coming towards me. I'm sitting there and I can feel the, what the stone of the arch feels like against my back. I can feel what the
Yeah.
sidewalk feels like on my butt. But then a guy comes walking in and he takes off his jacket and he points at the statue of George Washington that's right above my head. And he says, "Screw you, George Washington." And he throws his jacket on the ground and he walks away. And I was like, okay. But all these memories, like I look at that drawing and all these memories kind of come back, what it was like. I hadn't eaten breakfast yet. It's a weird thing that all this stuff comes into play. And it's an experience that anybody else looking at the drawing wouldn't see. They would say, oh, it's Fifth Avenue, but it is, as you said, the sponge. Yeah.
Yeah, it is. I've had that exact same experience where you. Oh no, screw you, George Washington. Yeah, of being out there with my journal, and I look back at the page, and I can. There are all these other parts of that experience, my sense experience of everything that was going on around me at that point, as if the sort of the lens of my perception was clear and clean, and all this stuff came in, and some of it went down on the page. And I like your description of the bookmark to your life and your experience, because the bookmark isn't the page. right? All that is there in your neural network. The bookmark just kind of helps you kind of get back there. You look at that journal page, and all of those details, even if you didn't write in a little voice balloon with the person saying "Screw you, George Washington,"
I'll never need to.
you'll never need to, or at least we have the impression that we'll never need to. There's just all sorts of kind of interesting things about memories and how our memories do change over time. And we have the perception that our kind of connection with our memory is accurate, but our brains are constantly kind of splicing new things into those memories as we kind of move along. So as down the line, our memories get increasingly inaccurate. But I think it's actually not just a bookmark. I think it's a bookmark that kind of brings you back there, but it also is an anchor, because details of memories that we have morph over time. But if it is documented on the page, both, I think the work of putting that there on the page helps us to, that part of that memory is less likely to change over time. And also I can look down at the page, and there it is, a reminder of what I was looking at. And that also helps that part of that memory remains fixed, as opposed to kind of, you know, morphing and blending as my brain kind of handles its sort of standard way of remembering things.
So it's kind of like frozen on the page, or an amber on the page, as opposed to being like a thing that you have in your house that you're constantly like having to move around, move from closet to
That's right.
closet, then decide whether or not to throw it out and all those kinds of things. Yeah.
That's made out of slowly melting wax that you're constantly kind of re-sculpting so it still looks like that thing. Yeah, that it allows you, it takes you back vividly to that experience, and you also now have anchors in that experience that are less prone to change, because the way that human memories work is not like, pulling up a file in a computer. It's a it's a it's a it's a copy on a bad Xerox machine, and your memory, you have an experience, and then you remember it, and it comes out of the bad Xerox machine, and you can't really understand part of it. And so what your brain does then is it fills in all the gaps seamlessly, so that you have the subjective experience of remembering this experience vividly. When we remember things, we remember a full picture. But every time you remember something, there are new parts that you are, and when it goes through you then take that thing that you've retouched, you put that back down on the bad Xerox machine, and your memory pops out again, and it's now and you now have to retouch other things. So the more that you remember something, the more those memories degrade over time.
Right.
So, this allows you then to have kind of, you can bookmark that experience in your life, and then there are aspects of that you're going to be able to hold on to more vividly. Perhaps the color of the person's jacket that they throw on the ground, that changes over time. But something that you included in your journal there about that, that little detail, that's not that's less likely to change. Also, the scientist in me kind of likes this, because I then have I have documentation of, like, oh yeah, I saw this bird here in this place at this time, and there were 500 of them, and now I can go back and kind of compare that over time.
Interesting. I mean, I think another part of it is also that we remember something, and then we choose or force ourselves to forget certain things that might be traumatic or make us look bad or whatever it is. There's some reason that we change things, right? And then we come
Mhm.
back to that memory, not quite remembering why it was we've changed the memory. We have now an incomplete memory. And so we fabricate connective tissue to fill in those blanks, which forms a whole new concoction that isn't really the memory at all. It's kind of like the game telephone, right? Where you are passing on this information, incomplete information. And so, like I
That's a
have
great
memory,
analogy.
yeah, like I have memories from when I was a kid, and I think, like I always, here's an example. When I was little, I remember I had a vivid memory of sitting in a room in London on a radiator that was turned off with my mother and my grandmother eating strawberries. And then years later, I remember telling my mother, I remember this scene. Like, do you remember when that was, where that was? And she said, that could never have happened. They don't have strawberries in England. And I was like, really? Okay. And then years later, I thought, of course they have strawberries in England. What's she talking about? Like, that doesn't make any sense at all. And so, meanwhile, this memory has gotten more and more jumbled. And I think, do they have radiators in London? No, do they? And so now this memory is completely unreliable and and strange. And I'm like, why did I remember that? And then I also said to my mother years later again, why did you say that there weren't strawberries in England? And she said, I would never have said that. Of course there are strawberries in England.
Oh,
It's like,
that's getting meta.
yeah, so it's like, okay, it's a memory of a memory of a memory that has, and I don't even know what I actually remember anymore. And I often think about a thing that really spooks me out is this notion that every 7 years we replace all the cells in our body. So that memory from half a century ago is actually something that a whole other organism, not me at all, not this me right
Mhm.
now sitting and talking to you. It's just this weird, I'm like, a building that was built on top of the ruins of another building, on top of ruins of another building, and going back to ancient Rome. And none of it is actually real at all. It's all completely. But we'll talk about this another time because we're about to run out of time. But I want to talk at some point about the simulation that we've been living in since the pandemic began. This computer simulation and all the fantasies I have around that. But that's for another episode. That'll bring you back to, if you haven't tuned out already, we'll talk about that in a future episode.
Yeah. And I'd love to explore this idea of memory with you more because I think it is
If we
such
remember,
a.
if we remember, we should definitely do
That's
that.
right.
Let's write it
But
down in our
maybe
sketchbook.
what I can do is want to share with you one of my favorite poems by Billy Collins.
That would be great.
And this one is called This Much I Do Remember. And, in here we've been talking about the act of getting an experience down in our sketchbook as a way of recording that and connecting with that. I see Billy Collins as sort of doing a similar thing, but by writing a poem around it.
Can you recite that poem?
I at one point I could, and I
Then
no longer can, but I've got a copy of it up in front of me,
okay, so
and
that would be
so I
good.
can. So here's the poem.
You just telling us the version that you remember, and then we can actually read the actual version. No, we don't have time. Just let's read the.
Oh,
Why don't you just
we'll
read?
do that. Here it is. He says, "It was after dinner. You were talking to me across the table about something or another, a greyhound you'd seen that day or a song you liked, and I was looking past you, over your bare shoulder at the three oranges lying on the kitchen counter next to the small electric bean grinder, which was also orange, and the orange and white cruets for vinegar and oil, all of which converged into a random still life, so fastened together by the hasp of color, and so fixed behind the animated foreground of your talking and smiling, gesturing and pouring wine, and the camber of your shoulders, that I could feel it being painted within me, brushed on the wall of my skull while the tone of your voice lifted and fell in its flight, and the three oranges remained fixed on the counter the way stars are said to be fixed in the universe. Then all the moments of the past began to line up behind that moment, and all the moments to come assembled in front of it in a long row, giving me reason to believe that this was a moment I had rescued from the millions that rushed out of sight into a darkness behind the eyes.
Hmm.
Even after I've forgotten what year it is, my middle name, and the meaning of money, I will still carry in my pocket the small coin of that moment, minted in the kingdom that we pace through every day.
I love that. I also like the idea that that feels authentic, right? You know that that actually happened to him,
Yeah.
right? He didn't create that. I mean, he created the poem, of course, but that moment happened. He turned it into a poem, and we've now re-experienced it,
Mm-hmm.
right? And also, it reminds us of things, right?
And it takes this ordinary moment and it makes it special just through the act of this deliberate intention of you're putting it into your sketchbook. You could have done that with any of those other moments in there, and they would have been. It didn't have to be the orange and white cruets for vinegar and oil, right? It could have been something else, but it becomes special because of the deliberate attention that we give to it. And so you get to be the curator of your memories. And by keeping your sketchbook, you are choosing which of all the moments out of the fabric of your life do you want to pick out and say this one and kind of keep it with you. I think that's beautiful.
It is, and that's why we make art. That's why art matters,
That's right.
because art shines a light on our lives, and it's a light we can share. We can share Billy Collins' experience, and we can also tie it into our own lives. So it unites us, and it also shows us things that we may not have thought of. We hadn't really realized that that was beautiful, perhaps, until he showed us how it is. And so our lives are richer for it, more meaningful, and we're connected to each other. I mean, those are incredibly important things to experience and to have. So many of our perceptions of what art is for and what it's about and why we make it are just so distorted. That's would be another good topic for another time, is what art really is and why we think it's something that the rich people buy to hang on the walls or something. So, or that you have to be very intellectual and have degrees in to understand. So, yeah. Well, I think, look, we've managed to fill an hour with blather. I think that was good. Maybe that's what we can call this call this podcast, the blather hour.
The Blather
Jack
Hour.
and Danny. Yeah. But this was fun, and we will do it again next week.
Well,
Who
I
knows what
look
we'll talk
forward
about then?
to just playing with more ideas, and thank you so much for the conversation.
Yes, thank
Um,
you. This was really fun.
it was really fun for me too, Danny.
Good.